Hey, Kristan, how's it going?
Hey, how you doing, Sean? I'm surprised we haven't met sooner since we've been in the same business for a long time.
I know, but here we are. I'm just bear with me. I'm just bringing one more guest in. So we've got Kristan, we've got Addy Ads has been invited, and we've got Matthew Russell Lee yet to come in. One second, here he is. Found him. Yes, there we go. Incorrectly said that Steeples was coming on, but I don't think he is. So how long have you been on this case, Kristan?
Since the beginning. I arrived in New York. I was there at the first real day of the prosecution, identifying the witnesses, bringing witnesses to testimony. I've been there for the entire event. Jury deliberation, though, since Christmas, I have come home here in Milwaukee. It's kind of boring to sit there and watch the mainstream read their books while they're waiting for a post-it note to be handed around once every 8 hours. It's a little bit of a waste of time and money for anyone that sponsors or invests in me going out to cover this event, as we have locals that are there that I've been bringing onto the show. But we did file transcripts. For the only website to release the actual courtroom stenographer transcripts. So we have them for all the victims, including Jane Doe, Katie, Carolyn, Annie Farmer, including the Butler and the Kelly McGuire testimony. It's been quite interesting to see that the same transcripts that we decided to invest and pay for, because they're $1.25 per page. Now, I don't know if you realize on the average day there's 3,000 pages of transcripts. It can become quite expensive, but thank God that we have great supporters at therundownlive.com. Our talk radio program is surging and blowing up, and we've been able to bring to light the actual conversations that were happening in the courtroom for the public. So,
Right, so we've just been speaking to Kristan. We're talking about the M trial now, and we're just going to go around the guests. Huge thank you for spending this evening with us. We're just going to go around the guests right now and just let them tell you who they are, why they got interested in this case, and where we could find them on the social so we can support them. So, Kristan, do you want to start, Kristan, with you, and how you got interested in the Maxwell case? What's your trajectory been?
well, it was actually a local who saw me as a witness in a recent trial here in Wisconsin that was televised across the world, and it was around the Kenosha unrest. So they ended up being able to crowdsource a couple $1,000s to send me out there, and I promised that I would do my best to use that money responsibly and bring as much information as I could out there. I do a talk radio program 5 days a week called The Rundown Live on KGRA. The podcasts are available anywhere podcasts are found, and we've had great guests on there from from musicians to athletes to movie stars to politics and activists. So we're all over the board, but it was wonderful to come on down there and meet other Wisconsin lights like Addy Ads. And of course, pretty much everyone in this chat, we've had a chance to have a conversation throughout the last 3 weeks.
Addy Ads, who came all the way to Guildford, Surrey, to film podcasts with me and Pepsi Watson. What a guy. Man, you've been blowing up on YouTube with your Maxwell coverage.
Yes, sir. Yes, I have, Sean. And on Twitter, especially, is really seeing an uptick, which I've really been grateful. And how I got into this actually is your fault, Sean. I think you and Ryan. So I have you guys to thank, and I would say the best sources out there as far as writing a heavier book here. I actually was telling somebody's doing a documentary about the defendant, and they had not heard of Sean's book, and so I highly recommended it to them, and I think they're going to grab it. So that was pretty fantastic. But likewise with Kristan, I'm from Wisconsin. I've done quite a bit of traveling, as Sean mentioned. Free Pepsi Watson. I interviewed Pepsi as well as Sean in England over a couple of years ago now. So I really owe both of those guys a lot of my success, I would say, especially going deep into 2020 when everybody was kind of locked up on the internet there. But I've been featured in the Gateway Pundit Unlimited Hangout for my election, and then consequently Epstein coverage. Run a podcast, and then a Twitter. Released a book earlier this year, and actually Sean's in that book. He's got a chapter on him, and it's something I've been doing independently too. I'm haven't yet to be affiliated with any major outlet. So that's my spiel.
I just got a message from my technical department that there's a video playing in the background of one of the guests. Is it possible to mute the video or mute the TV? Or has anyone got a video playing in the background? No? Okay. All right, Matthew, we'll move on to you. How did you get into the case?
Sure. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry for the kind of drab background. I cover the Southern District of New York courthouse, so this is not the only case here that I cover. But I actually first fell onto the Maxwell case when I was reporting from the United Nations. They invited her in. This was long after Epstein had served his 13 months in Palm Beach, and they invited Maxwell in to promote her TerraMar project inside the United Nations. Found it pretty amazing. The United Nations has its own problems with various kinds of abuse. So I started asking questions about it. Ultimately, I was thrown out of the United Nations, but I've found a perch here in the courthouse. And in this case, I've covered it. From I was actually, when Epstein was hauled in from Teterboro Airport, I was here for the press conference. Then obviously he died, and then Maxwell. So I was here for that one too. And I actually asked the then U.S. Attorney Audrey Strauss why they charged her with perjury. Not that she may not be guilty of it, but why, if there was any chance of her cooperating against others higher up, that sort of undercut it right there with that decision. So anyway, I'm covering it. I'm sorry. The reason I'm in this drab background is I'm going to be monitoring if there is a note. I'm not reading a book, but I am trying to keep track of those Post-it notes, simply because we may decide, it may be determined today either that there's a verdict or that the deliberations are postponed due to the COVID outsurge. So it seems worth keeping an eye on. But thanks a lot. I'm glad to be here, and I'm a follower of all of my fellow guests here.
So that, just touching on TerraMar a minute then, to explain to the viewers. So she was selling like hypothetical virtual real estate in the oceans, wasn't she?
Yeah, that was the kind of the con. But I think more than anything, she was trying to rehabilitate herself with this idea that she was a big philanthropist. In fact, I just put online, as part of her bail application, she had somebody write a letter saying that her great philanthropic works had taken her to the UN and to a TED Talk. It's more than just that she went to the UN and they allowed her to kind of, whether you call it blue washing because of the UN or the ocean, or green washing. The UN actually had a representative on the board of TerraMar, had only 5 board members, one of whom was the UN's head of partnerships, who I'd gotten to know. I mean, the UN has a lot of serious corruption problems, and so that was she. As soon as Epstein was arrested, she immediately TerraMar. You won't find a lot of traces of it on the internet, but I definitely covered it and put up the 99, the IRS filings that they made of who the board members are. I want to say this. I from a lot of feedback on Twitter and elsewhere, I know that there's a huge hunger to sort of see her convicted, and clearly I sort of joined in that. But I think the case should have been much wider. I think it was a big mistake that they decided to only prosecute her with 4 witnesses, only basically Palm Beach, New Mexico, New York, nothing about the Virgin Islands, Little St. James, nothing about the sort of wider implications of the case. And I think that's, I think sometimes people can lose track of it. I'm not at all saying she should get a cooperator's deal, but if anybody knows who Epstein was filming and why, it's her. And facing a long jail sentence, I do believe that she might talk, but maybe not now. Anyway, let me turn it over to Joe.
We've got Joe Neerman, Good Lawgic. And Joe, what got you interested in this case, and what's your background?
So my name is Joseph Neerman. I'm the host of a YouTube channel called Good Lawgic, which is spelled Lawgic, because I am a New York litigator turned YouTube content creator. And I talk news, politics, and law on my channel. During that Kenosha trial that took place a couple of months ago, that I became part of a panel of different attorneys who were covering the Kyle trial, and we were popularly referred to as LawTube, and we ended up garnering a lot of attention, working together as a panel on a channel hosted by Nick Recato from Recato Law, and so much popularity that our online presence was beyond comprehension. We had, by the time the verdict came in on that particular trial, 130,000 people watching us live, and not to mention all the people who came afterwards and saw that. Compared to the biggest legacy media online presence, which was roughly 50,000 people, so we were 2.5 times as big as anyone on legacy media with respect to our online presence. And after that trial concluded, the next trial everyone wanted to know about was the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. And the problem is that the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, unlike that Kenosha trial, is not being shared with the public. The only way you can gain access to it is you have to actually go down to the courtroom, and they have set up different viewing rooms for journalists to go in there. And there was an outcry from my fans and all fans of Law 2 that they wanted to know from an attorney who they know is not going to be tilted, but it's going to give them facts as it's coming in there as to what's going on in the case. And I have a unique ability because of my geography, that I'm close enough to go back and forth from my home to the Southern District of New York and actually watch it, take notes, and then share that with the audience, that I felt I can give a unique perspective as a New York litigator as to the effectiveness of both prosecution and defense, the fairness of the judge, and provide that insight. Now, as it happens, my peer here, Mr. Matthew Lee, happens to be a New York attorney as well. This is something I did not know when I first started. His focus seems to be, and does a phenomenal job as far as sharing transcripts and letting people know literally word by word what's happening for various significant moments in the trial. And I think that what each of us are bringing here is something somewhat different, unique, where I'm really fixating on the law and the direction that prosecution has been taking, the effectiveness of defense, and the different strategies, so I can sort of present to the public at large an unfiltered perspective as to exactly how well this case is being litigated and what questions the public may have about how the prosecution is approaching things and things of that nature.
So a lot of people think the fix is in, that the big names have been precluded on purpose, political motivations, intelligence motivations, national security, all that jazz. Observing the trial unfold then, or whatever you're hearing about it, how do you think the verdict is going to come in? Is she's got this war chest of what, 20 million plus to pay these high priced lawyers, but the judge really seems to have gone against her in many of the motions. So let's go around then and just we'll get each person's assessment, starting with Kristan, of what you think the verdict will be.
Well, I probably have the most unpopular opinion amongst everyone here, most likely, but I think that based on, it was the prosecution's job to provide hard evidence that would not allow any doubt within the jury. And the question is, did the testimonies of Annie Farmer, of Carolyn, Katie, and Jane Doe, Nadia from Days of Our Lives, was that enough to sway the jury in order to prosecute and indict, Ghislaine Maxwell? I'm not quite sure. I think that the defense did a really good job in many shapes and forms, poking holes, having things redacted. They were obviously the more experienced lawyers in the room. However, the prosecution did a really good job with many of the rebuttals. And the question is what stuck with the jurors? And I think I'm 50-50 on this one. I'm saying don't be surprised if she's acquitted of these charges, but then they go after her for perjury and she gets a slap on the hand versus being put in jail for life for trafficking. They brought up a lot of evidence around Jeffrey Epstein. They had 40,000 videos and photographs that they acquired from their raid on the New York Manhattan mansion of Epstein, in which they've only used 40 of, and they're all like, Ghislaine, here she is massaging Epstein's foot, while I try not to gag and puke here. That's essentially what they're providing. And so we're going based on testimony. Where was Virginia Roberts' testimony? Where was Sarah Kellen? Where were some of these other people that were actually abused by Epstein? And we've seen some of them show up for the jury deliberation. And these are women that didn't even take the stand. So I'm saying it's 50-50. It all depends on how much they pulled on the heartstrings of the jury. The hard evidence, I don't believe personally, was really provided, although testimonial evidence is considered fact. So we'll see. We'll see how the jury decides. It all depends on what they are discussing right now, and with post-it notes and highlighters and pulling the transcripts. I think they're pulling the right transcripts. They're all the ones I pulled, straight from the stenographer courtroom.
Thanks, Kristan. Addy?
Yeah, I would say I'm a little less, I think the possibility of her walking, for me, has decreased in my mind over the past week and a half. I'm not ruling it out, but I see her definitely getting charged with the enticement and then the transportation of a minor. But as far as the trafficking and the conspiracy to transport, pardon me, there's no co-conspirators that were brought into court, and the only one that was really mentioned definitively was Mr. Epstein, and he's dead. So as far as the conspiracy charges, I'm just not really sure how those are gonna stick. But the enticement charge, especially, and then the transportation one, I could definitely see. And then, as Kristan mentioned, the perjury charges are being severed and tried separately. But I do want to say about the defense, I'd say most of the trial, I thought they were doing a better job. I think the prosecution ended. Their closing arguments were much better, I would say, by far and away. And some of the highest points, I think, probably came from Pomerantz, who's also on the prosecution. But I think I'm like most people. I want to see the book thrown at her, and I think it's 40 years at least for the conspiracy charges.
Thanks, Addy. Matthew?
Sure. I try. I mean, I notwithstanding Joe's summary of how I'm doing it, I sort of pull back from making a prediction just because I'm treating it. I'm approaching it kind of journalistically. I guess I would expect, if I had to say it, probably a mixed verdict. Seems like from the questions that they're asking that they're dubious of some of the charges, although zeroing in on others. Like there's this whole question of the flights to New Mexico and Maxwell's role in whether it was going to New Mexico, in which case it would be inducing to sexual crimes, or leaving, in which case it would be more like a travel agent. But I think the one thing I can add here is that it's an open question whether there will even be a verdict reached. Not an open question, but there's at least today, Judge Nathan said, in light of the surge of Omicron variant in New York, that she's either going to more seriously tell the juries, you got to stay until you reach a decision, or it sounded to some like she was saying she might suspend deliberations. I mean, I'm covering other cases here where witnesses are testing positive and they're postponing trials. It would be kind of a travesty to postpone it. I want to say another thing about the trial, just to be sure to get it said. One of the reasons we've come to this crunch time is that in the midst of the trial, there was a 3-day hiatus. And without being mean-spirited about it, some of it wasn't really said why that happened, but it became pretty clear. Judge Nathan, Allison Nathan, highly respected judge in this courthouse, was nominated for a promotion to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And for some reason, rather than wait for the end of the trial, it was determined that she would go down to Washington and lobby or seek confirmation for 3 days, right in the middle of the trial. So basically, the jurors were all not going to work. They all had the time off. There's no way to do the trial without the judge. 3 days off of the trial, and now we're hitting this thing where all the judges in the courthouse are saying this is a crisis. Things that were in person are now going to go virtual. So I don't know. There's a wild card in here. I will also say that today I've made, I think it may be my 5th request, but a request to Judge Nathan in writing that she reinstall a call-in line so that people can actually call in and hear it. Therefore, people like Addy that wasn't unable to get into the courthouse yesterday. When I heard that, I was outraged. And I think there's others. Even people from South Africa can't fly to New York. And as we know, the Epstein Lolita Express plane went to a number of these countries. So I think I've asked Judge Nathan to reconsider her decision to have no call-in line. That would at least remove some of the pressure of people coming into the courthouse being exposed to it. But we'll see what happens today. It really is an open question.
And Joseph.
So I first of all, I want to apologize to Matthew. I wasn't trying to mischaracterize your coverage. Your coverage has been phenomenal, and I also have respect for everyone here. So I hope you didn't take any offense to that. Certainly none was intended.
I really didn't. It's just I agree.
Okay, so I agree with Matthew that the prosecution basically has, I think they've run two different operations at the same time. On the one hand, and I think paramount, is that they're doing everything they can to restrict any of the larger names, the more significant names, from being mentioned in this trial at all. And I think they started with that as, okay, we're definitely going to do that. We're definitely going to insulate those names from being mentioned at trial. Once they started with that, I think they went as hard as they can to convict Ghislaine on anything that they could. I think that they're really trying their hardest, and they're very intelligent counsel. They're very shrewd counsel on the prosecution side as well as the defense side. If you look at the best lawyering moments probably I would think the majority of them actually fall on the side of the prosecution, more so than on the side of defense. I've been very impressed with some of the questions that have been thrown out there, some of the strategies. Maureen Comey, who everyone is terrified because she's James Comey's daughter, and he's a very political individual and very polarizing, and really not popular with either the left or the right, but certainly seem towards favoring the big names and protecting big names. So there's a lot of concerns that Maureen Comey is not really investing herself in this case. And I will tell you that if we start with an assumption that she's not going to be naming any big names, then given that she has fought like the Dickens to try and get Ghislaine Maxwell convicted. And as someone here mentioned earlier, there have been favorable decisions by the judge to the prosecution with respect to numerous issues that could have gone the other way. And I think that if you watch this trial, the entire time I'm trying to think from both an emotional reason, and both emotionally and also from a legal perspective, because my role is to sort of convey to the public, how strong is the law here. And I will tell you this, that the law here was very shaky as to the basis of convicting Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, I, along with everyone else who has a soul and has watched this trial, wants to see Ghislaine Maxwell spend the rest of her life in prison. I'm dying for that to happen. The question is whether legally or not that case has been made. And I certainly agree that the limitation of who comes in here to testify has made that more difficult. However, I take heart in two things. First and foremost, from those who have been in the courtroom, because I and the rest of the panel here, most of the panel, on a day-to-day basis, are not in the actual courtroom with the jury. We are in viewing rooms on different floors where they show us a video screen with an audio blaring from the front of the room, and we're taking notes on the testimony and discussion between counsel and the judge. But we don't see the jury. But there are a handful of people who get in there every day, and from what they've said, the jury really does not like Ghislaine Maxwell and or her counsel. They seem to be shaking their heads at her a lot and getting very upset with her, and with some of the badgering of the victims when they're on the stand, and they were badgered, each of them, for 4 hours. So what I take heart is in two things. There's enough here to hang your hat on, especially with the broad net that the judge allowed as for bases of conviction. So when the trial was finished, before the jury charges are read, I was like, look, everyone wants to convict her. The question is whether there's legally enough here to convict her. And I think that sometimes people will sort of ignore the law. Juries will frequently ignore the law to a degree, or read the law as favorably as possible to insert their will into the ultimate verdict. And I thought that this is a good chance of happening here, given everything I've heard about the jury. So my prediction actually coming out of this is, even though legally it's a little bit tenuous, because of the deep hatred that the entire world has for Ghislaine Maxwell, and the fact that the jury was given a broad net to catch her, I'm expecting that she's going to be facing convictions of at least a couple of decades. And that's what I'm hoping for. The longer this jury deliberates, the more concerned I am about that. I'm sort of the opposite of Addy adds. I think the longer they wait, I would have thought that their emotion would have come out more quickly, and that we would have heard a decision like that, in the first couple of days. And I think that these constant delays are making things much harder. If she would sequester them and lock them away, I think we would have a verdict in 48 hours. But letting them, catering to them and saying, oh, you guys want off? Oh, okay, so we'll close down tomorrow. We'll close down 2 days before Christmas. Instead of locking them away and saying, look, you're going to bang heads until you come to a conclusion here. I think that's a reason why we've been stuck spinning our wheels waiting for a jury to reach a decision.
Yeah, and I think that would satisfy the public if she did get at least a couple of decades. And no doubt Virginia's, been precluded because the Queen's favourite son, for starters, would be mentioned, and a whole host of other big names. Right, so we've had a question come in from a viewer then, and we'll go around the panel again. And who's the judge? So the question's changed. There was a question earlier, which was, I'll put these two questions together. The earlier question was, why are the jury deliberating for so long? And the second question, which could perhaps be answered quite simply by the first guest, who is the judge for the perjury charge? So we'll start with Kristan.
Well, I have the answer for the first one a little bit. I can give a little insight as a person as part of the Kyle trial and a witness in that trial of the unrest in Kenosha. the Kenosha trial took about 4 days, and they had very clear-cut evidence. And I think a lot of it is understanding the law, researching the law, verifying that there was actually laws broken by looking at the transcripts, cross-referencing them. That's why they're asking for post-its. That's why they're asking for highlighters, and then disqualifying things that may not, that they can't prove absolutely. And they're probably going through each, I would say, what would I call it? They're deliberating charge on them. There we go. I was having a problem coming up with the word charge. Thanks, Joe. And going through them independently. And it isn't like it's just 1 or 2 charges. They have 6 charges, I believe. And they're probably going through them charge by charge and verifying that there's enough evidence to support those charges. Now, I do agree with Joe. There could be a little pressure put on them to put on a quicker decision. But the question is if you were on trial and the same situation was happening, would you consider that some kind of meddling, as where they could be coming with some kind of natural verdict, taking their time to make sure they're making the right decision? And if you were on trial, what kind of government system do you want to see? So don't be surprised if the jury deliberation goes in a little longer. But I kind of predicted, I think I told Addy adds this and Joe before, that it would be very it wouldn't be too conceivable that they would decide to drop it during the holidays or in between Christmas and New Year's. Now, when everyone's away with the family, they're all busy, less likely to get attention from the media. Whether or not there's any hand in that, it seems like if we're pushing the trial back, we're pushing it back, hoping that there'll be a verdict in a certain time frame. So we'll see what the jury deliberates and what they decide to come out with. We can also take a look at some of Epstein's prior cases and see how those came out. Did they have similar witness testimonies? Why was the decision come by the jury for those situations, and why were they the result as they were? But above and beyond that, I'm not quite sure who the judge is for the perjury charge, but I'm sure one of my colleagues here would.
Yeah, I'm sure Mr. Lee probably knows that one. But as far as the length of deliberation for the jury, I'm going to go back to the idea that was brought up with regards to the weird last 2 weeks we had with, I think, just 3 days last week and then 2 days the week before that, obviously with her important promotion, which did seem to be, in the context of this trial, interesting timing, I think, to put it euphemistically. But that combined with, the fact that they were not required to deliberate last Thursday or to be sequestered. That was optional, the Thursday day, I mean. So, I think I would agree with that too. There's a flow process you get into with any creative project. And once you stop that and take a few days off, that momentum is lost and you have to rebuild it. And we kind of saw that like the first, day of this week, they're asking for Post-it notes and markers and such. So I think those are probably the reasons I see that being. And it's an idea that's been echoed too, is the longer they deliberate, it may seem to benefit the defense. But again, there's, I think, some pushback on that idea.
All right, thanks, Addy. Over to Matthew. Oh, something's
all right. Here we go. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I'm just trying to reduce. Sometimes the marshals will come through here, so you'll hear clanking. The chains that are waiting for Ghislaine. It's not yet known who would have the perjury charges. It was severed. It was all one case at the beginning, and then it was cut into 2 cases, both before Judge Nathan. If Judge Nathan is confirmed, which seems it might happen 51-49, but it seems almost certain to happen, it will be wheeled out to a new judge. I think the other kind of interesting question that's come up is, if Ghislaine Maxwell is convicted, would Nathan keep the case for the sentencing? And there is some precedent for that. There's a judge called Richard Sullivan here who was promoted from district to appeals court, and he still hears all of the cases that he had before. So that would be kind of it will be interesting to see one way or another. I want to go back to this thing of the 3 days in DC, because it's easy to say, this jury, a lot of people here are saying, like, the jury, what's wrong with them? They don't want to work. They were told from the beginning that they would have the Thursday and Friday of both the weeks, Christmas and New Year's, off. And in fact, and ironically, Judge Nathan, through a juror who had been selected, was on the precipice of being on the jury, off because they said that they had their spouse had given them a prepaid trip between Christmas and New Year's. And Judge Nathan said, no way, we can't delay this trial for those 2 days, not at all. And then next thing you know, 3 days chopped out of the middle. So I think there was a sense that she couldn't chop 3 days and then tell the jury, you've got to work Thursday. It's coming. This is going to be the same issue that will happen this week if they don't decide by Thursday, because she told them in advance, you have Thursday off. So clearly they can't have made plans, and it doesn't, she's not in a position to tell them, change your plan, because she didn't change her plans, or said another way, she did change her plans. So I want to, and again, I don't mean it to be, I don't want to be naive. Maybe everyone does that, but I can imagine a judge saying, I'll come down to Washington to be interviewed when the trial is over, because the Senate Judiciary Committee, they don't just meet one day. And she didn't get, there were a number of judges confirmed right before Christmas. She wasn't among them. She could have waited. I think that may have ended up being a mistake. You mentioned Prince Andrew, and I just want to, before either the change come clanking through, there is I don't know if it's not breaking news, but it's what passes for courthouse news. There's a separate case, which is Virginia Roberts Giuffre against Prince Andrew, that I'm sure you've heard of. There was a filing today where Prince Andrew, through counsel, is trying to get it stayed and dismissed on jurisdiction, saying that Virginia Giuffre has said that she's based jurisdiction on living in Colorado. They put into the record like her voting records from Colorado, her home address there, her phone number, not who she voted for, but it's almost. And they bought these records from some private genealogy site. So personally, I'm an American. I have no real axe to grind one way or another with Prince Andrew, but I will say it doesn't seem very classy to dox your accuser, particularly when in the Nathan trial, everything is being redacted. And I'll give you an example. The flight logs, they're redacted not just for the names of the victims, the names of the passengers. For example, it said that, everything is redacted. So how much more private? I don't know if you have a right to be we may have even a right to be on a private jet to Little St. James. But I think that your voting records, when purchased through a kind of shadowy genealogy site, probably shouldn't go into the docket. And I think that the British people should know this is, to this low has Prince Andrew sunk.
Just got a quick follow-up question, Matthew, before we go to Joe.
Sure.
In this situation like this, would it be advantageous for Maxwell to be sentenced by the trial judge, or would it be better to go to a different judge?
Well, that would be interesting. There are judges that are harder line than Judge Nathan. For example, I'll actually this is one way to answer it. One of the questions raised to Judge Nathan on her confirmation hearing, they haven't voted yet, but they had a hearing and asked her questions, was why she had reduced a prisoner's sentence under compassionate release due to COVID. She's not viewed as the hardest line judge in this courthouse. There are judges here, Judge Sullivan being among them, but Judge Cote, Judge Caproni, that lay down some serious sentences. I covered here a trial of a Honduran brother of the president of Honduras for drug trafficking. He got life plus 30. Like the plus 30 is a bit, whatever. It's beyond the grave. So probably she would, if she were convicted. It might be good to stay with Nathan, especially if Nathan is able to Here's the funny thing. I don't think I'm often playing into some of these dark questions because I feel like the secrecy of the trial, the lack of a call in line, the redactions. If people have doubts, the courts have it coming to them. But this promotion could have been offered even if Judge Nathan weren't the judge on this trial. There are a variety of reasons. President Biden is trying to go for a much more diverse appeals court and judiciary. Allison Nathan is openly a lesbian. This was played up by Chuck Schumer in the nomination. So I feel like she could have gotten this anyway. That's why it probably would have been better to not take those 3 days off and just keep the two things separate. Now in people's minds, and it was a mistake, I think, on her part not to say the 3 days off is so I can go to DC. She didn't say anything about it. It just happened. And so, and there's a weird kind of note. And that's also the difference between, I think, I'm glad to be with this crowd because there is a kind of an in-house, the coverage of the courts is sometimes too friendly to the prosecution and to the judges because these are repeat players. So the prosecution is able to kind of dole out information like there's a note coming, here's the exhibits. And so people tend to not be critical. Like Maureen Comey being the prosecutor, I mean, it's just a fluke. Let's say it's a fluke. Could they have found somebody that wasn't the daughter of James Comey to do the prosecution? Should they have? I think they should have. Maybe it seems unfair to her, but there's a lot of cases. There's a lot of corruption cases here she could have done. I think this was a kind of a thumbing your nose or just counting on people thinking that critics will be written off as conspiracy theorists, right? This case goes it raises all kinds of political issues, whether it's from Bill Clinton, Bill Richardson, a slew of individuals. And so to have somebody who's clearly a political figure have his daughter as the prosecutor is a mistake.
Okay, Joe. Thanks, Matthew.
No, sure.
I'm not sure which questions you want me to answer at this point. So, I mean, you're asked, yeah, if you want to ask me, just clarify which questions you want me to address, because I don't want to.
All right. So the viewer asked about, why it was getting deliberated for so long. And
well, I will point out on that, if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
There's 6 charges here, and the charges are very confusing to even most attorneys. Now, I'm not a criminal defense attorney by trade. I've always been a commercial litigator personally, but I'm sufficiently intelligent that I can understand what's happening in a criminal trial, and I become more and more. I brought in my depth and understanding of criminal law as I've been covering other cases leading up to this case. And I'm telling you now, I had to look at these charges 5 times to distinguish between this charge and that charge and the other charge. And I'm an attorney who's been practicing law for 20 plus years. Imagine if you're a layperson and you're sitting here trying to parse out the difference between transporting and what can we charge on. And you have to realize that the 6 charges, there's basically 3 substantive charges and 3 conspiracy charges, which lead into each of those substantive charges. And then, so it's like, so what's the difference between conspiracy and culpability under the substantive charge? That's the first thing. And then you got to figure out what's the difference between this substantive charge and that substantive charge. Plus, we have jury instructions, which say that for conspiracy, you, the jury, are allowed to consider all victims anytime between 1994 and 2004. But with respect to the substantive charge, for the exact same thing, meaning if you have conspiracy charge of illegally transporting for purposes of engaging in illegal sexual conduct. So that's one of the charges. Then there's conspiracy to do that exact same thing. So for conspiracy to do that, you can consider all victims between 1994. But for the actual charge itself, not conspiracy, you can only consider a victim named Jane between the years 1994 and 1997. That is very confusing to me. Even looking back on it now, trying to explain to the audience why that would be, why that should be, why that makes sense legally. Now you're sitting with 11, imagine you're a layperson sitting with 11 other people trying to figure out, wait, so do we have enough here on Jane? And if we don't have enough here based on our belief of the testimony of Jane for 1994-97, is there enough here from the other victims? And what about this victim? And can we consider that? It's very confusing. And then when you get to charges 3 and 4, they seem so close to what number 1 and 2 are that you're going to try to figure out, well, why are we being asked on this? And how is this different? It's very, very confusing. I do think that the delay of time also, where she's basically swaddling the jury like they're little infants and can do whatever they want and go away from whatever times they want. Or, I mean, Matthew is sort of saying that the judge is handcuffed. Because she herself took off time, so now she's forced to commit to the time that she promised the jury that they would get off. I've seen enough of federal judges to know that they don't really care about living up to the same rules that they accept for themselves. Federal judges are notorious for basically feeling as if they are God of their courtroom, and that's the expectation that everyone who's in their presence should understand. So for her to live by different rules than what she's applying to others would not at all be the first. She'd be far from the first or last federal judge to live by different rules than what she applies to others. So now she has seemed fair. I'll tell you this much. She has seemed fair. So maybe she is trying to live by the same standard. I think that if she wants a decision, she does need to sequester them. And I'll tell you, Sean, you were saying, well, is that unfair? That's an interesting philosophical question. If you put pressure on them by sequestering them now, is that unfair for defendants in general? Is that a violation of civil liberties? And what I would tell you is this. I don't think it's unfair, because in many trials the jury is sequestered from out of the gate. Many of us were surprised that in this trial they were not sequestered. That's a common thing that happens for American juries, especially when you have a political trial like this one. And this is perhaps arguably the most political trial we've had in decades in this country. So for a political trial like this, where the media is so interested in it and there's so much, international attention to this trial, to me, I was shocked that they were not sequestered out of the gate. So now to sequester them in the middle, saying, look, you've deliberated for days and days, and you still don't seem to be any closer as far as we know. At this point, to put a little more pressure on them by sequestering them, I don't think that's undue influence by the judge, because I think that's pressure that should have applied out of the gate, as has been applied in thousands of cases like this throughout American history.
So we've had a question come in from one of my co-hosts and regular guests. Matthew Steeples is actually writing a book about the Maxwell case. And he has put, what do your panel think of what will happen at Maxwell's second trial regarding lying under oath? Will it even happen? All right, so back to Kristan.
I'm going to have a real quick answer on this. I think that one will be unescapable. If she is acquitted on charges here, I think that would be the slap on the wrist that they would nail her for, so she spends a limited time, so it doesn't look like it's a complete limited hangout, that she gets, some consequences for actions, and therefore this cherished United Nations Mongol gets some time, and it does not spend her whole life in jail because she was a useful tool. But on the other aspect, if the jury does come back with a prosecution and a sentencing, I would be excited for that. But at the same time, do we have that hard evidence? I think she definitely goes down for perjury.
All right, Addy.
I think that would be much easier for the government to prosecute, just because I think it's from, at least one of them, from the 2016 deposition she did. But as far as if it's going to happen, obviously if she goes the way of Mr. Epstein, that won't be the case, but I don't think that's going to happen, or would have happened by now. So I foresee it happening unless some black swan happens.
All right, over to Matthew.
I'll keep it brief on this one. I think that well, at least here's what interests me is if, and I'm not saying this would happen, I'm saying she's been denied bail like 5 times, right, as a flight risk, and because of the strength of the evidence against her. If she were somehow acquitted on these charges, I'm pretty sure she would make a bail application before any retrial on the perjury trial charges, and I think it would actually have she would have a lot of force to do that. I'm not saying that would happen, but it would be an interesting, even facing. Sometimes there's a case here of a CIA alleged leaker, Joshua Schulte, the Vault 7 case, and they severed off some charges to hold over his head. So even if you're acquitted on these, we've got this ace in the hole. But if she were acquitted on these, I would see she would be out in a New York minute, as they say, before the perjury charges.
That's an interesting thought, Matthew, because if there's anyone who's a flight risk, you would think it would be Ghislaine Maxwell. This is a woman who's traveling internationally on a regular basis. So,
have you heard of Thomas Barak? There's a guy. I'm sorry. I just want to say there's this guy who was a Trump acolyte who was lobbying for the UAE, and he had a private jet and all kind of stuff. He's out on bail. A lot of people get bail. So again, I'm not in any way defending Ghislaine Maxwell. I'm just saying there are a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of passports. I covered a UN bribery trial where a guy had 6 passports, including from 6 different countries, all purchased in money, and he was allowed out on bail.
Really?
So
I would hope they would put an ankle bracelet on her or something.
He's now back in Macau with one of his passports.
I think Thomas Barak is connected to Ghislaine Maxwell through Colony Capital.
I wrote that story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's in Mr. Atwood's book as well, in case you guys missed that one.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah.
I want to ask if I can. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions.
Go for it, Joe.
Yes, I wanted to ask Matthew, because you were implying that if she gets convicted, we might hear her turn on some names. And my question that's been bothering me, and a lot of people have floated that theory out there, but what doesn't make sense to me is we're looking at a government here who seems very determined to insulate these names from being named. So if they're that concerned that they don't even want to bring forward witnesses to help convict Ghislaine, because they're afraid they don't bring Virginia Roberts, because we don't want to hear, God forbid, Prince Andrew's name mentioned in this trial. So Why should we think that the same government that's protecting these people would cut her a deal after post-conviction in order to get her to testify and roll over on these names that they don't want to hear in the first place? Like, I don't understand the logic there.
I want to explain. I wasn't saying, I was saying I personally believe that when they first arrested her, they should have, that was the time to have the discussion about, do you want to be a cooperator or not? I totally agree. They have zero interest in it. I'm going to paint you a kind of a fantasia. Every day here at the courthouse, when the trial day ends, people wait, paparazzi, but journalists, live streamers, we've all been there. When Kevin Maxwell, Isabel Maxwell, Leah Safian, the whole team comes out. And sometimes they'll go and stand in front of the microphones in Foley Square and talk. I think that one card, if they felt she was about to be convicted, the card they should play is to say, the brother would be the one to do it, to say, my sister was ready to testify. We've got the names right here in this book, but they didn't want them. They just wanted to put the case to bed with her. But we stand ready to blow the whistle, and we'll go down to Washington, D.C. to the final vote on Judge Nathan's confirmation. You know, I'm saying this like it has to be done dramatically. I agree to you that the current DOJ has shown zero interest in expanding the case, but that doesn't mean that an energetic defendant with nothing to lose can't make their own public proffer.
Yeah, why didn't they grant immunity? Why didn't they grant immunity to all these additional witnesses if they really wanted to find out the truth? I know that there's mixed feelings on this, but keep in mind they had a slew of witnesses, and we only heard from 4, and they could have granted immunity, but they didn't. And if they did that, what would we have heard? Would we have heard a lot more of these names and the weaving behind the web of what was really going on and expose a lot of these additional individuals? And yeah, I agree. Like a lot of the names that could have been named in the flight logs, they weren't named. It was quite obvious. But why don't you grant immunity? Why don't you allow people to come and testify to find out what really happened? Otherwise, if someone is going to be prosecuted because of their testimony, I'm pretty sure they're going to plead the 5th.
Is that for Matthew?
No, just a statement.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for steering it in this direction, you guys, because this was the direction I was hoping it was going to go to. So researching drug cases then, whereby the DEA puts someone behind bars who's working for the CIA. You see the CIA comes in, overrules the DEA, says it's in the interest of national security that this person gets released somehow. And that's generally what happens. So what would the chain of causation be in this case, whereby Acosta said, you know, it's above my pay grade, these are working for intelligence? We can only speculate here because we'll never know, but I think people find it fascinating, this rabbit hole. Could you speculate on which agency would be involved? Would Biden have to green light this? How would this work? Let's start with Kristan.
Well, I don't know if that would ever be the case. We saw what the finders called the involvement with government there. We recently had releases by the FBI around this, and I don't think the CIA, which is probably the most likely to be involved in something that offers this kind of situation, or the FBI might have informants that could have been listed that might jeopardize other cases and things that they're working on. So I can't really say. That's kind of the what if game, but I could see that the CIA being involved, having assets and not wanting to expose those assets in order to protect and find out more, or they're just using all this information for blackmail. Keep in mind, they did acquire a lot of information from, Epstein's estate, and maybe they're using it as leverage somehow in the good old game of chess here. We're all just pawns in the game, like William Guy Carr says. So.
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, but a fun thought exercise nonetheless. I would say the CIA probably would have the final say as far as the American branch of this goes. But that's the thing too, is this is overlapping intelligence agencies, right? Overlapping governments. So if that were the case, I'm not sure our president would have any say in that. I'm not sure if our president chooses his his boxers in the morning or not. But yeah, I think it definitely would end with the CIA and then those overseas entities, which, you know, people probably knows what those are if you followed Sean's channel for a while now. And, you know, it would be probably the case that they would pick some outsiders along the edge of the group's outskirts, right, on the circle. Like, we don't really need him. She can probably go. We need this guy. We definitely need these people. But, you know, maybe we'll just offer a few more fish up to the crowd, some dead fish to throw into the peons.
Go with Matthew next then.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I think it's probably too late for that. I think that even people that are only not as deeply embedded in this case as we are, they think of like the deal, the sweetheart deal that Epstein got. So I think that there would be a lot more interest in this case if Ghislaine Maxwell got any kind of deal like that. At the same time, I was here in New York in the Eastern District. There was a senior Mexican general that was arrested with great fanfare for massive narco trafficking. And he was just released as a matter of governmental, you know, good comity with the Mexican government. Like, it went from one day saying like, this guy is the worst thing ever, to like, see you in Mexico City. So it would take, I think, I don't know if the UK carries that kind of diplomatic weight anymore, and also whether they would want to expend it in that way. But yeah, I think the frustration to me is that a lot of really well-placed kind of anger and immunity at Epstein and at Maxwell has the perverse result in allowing the people above them to get off. Because it's true, there would be a huge outcry if Maxwell were able to testify against other people and got a sweetheart deal from it. But that might be the move to limit impunity more than currently. But right now it works very well for them. This is just a way to put the whole thing in a box and put it away neatly. You know.
Great.
Okay, Joe. So you have to look at the legal perspective of things here, and the framework that needs to be worked within because of the law and the statute of limitations, as Matthew referenced. So when you're talking about, you have to ask yourself, the first question is, how is it that we have a trial in 2021 of Ghislaine Maxwell for crimes that were committed in 1994, as far back as 1994? And why is it we only have her? And what about that non-prosecution agreement that Jeffrey Epstein signed in 2007, 2008? So what happened with that, and which we all know was designed to protect not just him, but grant immunity to people who could be indicted as a co-conspirator with him, and that there were 5 women who worked underneath him, literally and figuratively, who were granted immunity as a basis of his plea agreement. Which, I mean, there's so many things that are bothersome about that plea agreement that I can't begin to enumerate them all. But now we're working in that framework. Whatever it is, how it is that got there, as corruptly as it got there, which it seems corrupt to most of us out on the outside, but it's still there. And it's considered, you know, binding on the government. So now the government has to work in that context. And then you also have to work in the statute of limitations context. These are 2 very restrictive contexts for who they can prosecute. So how do we get to it going after Ghislaine Maxwell? Well, in 2003, the federal government passed the PROTECT Act. The PROTECT Act basically extended a normal 10-year statute of limitations to being from 10 years to throughout the lifetime of the victim. So all these people, so because Jane was being abused during that 10-year period when the PROTECT Act was passed, Judge Nathan ruled in denying a motion to dismiss that because these acts took place in 1994 and the PROTECT Act came into effect before the statute of limitations passed for those violations, meaning in 2003, the government could have raised charges against Ghislaine Maxwell for what had happened in Jane because it was within that 10-year window. Now that PROTECT Act serves to extend that 10-year window all the way out throughout the lifetime of Jane. So that's why we don't have a statute of limitations act. But the PROTECT Act, we have to start with, only impacts illegal conduct of minors, meaning if there's other illegal sexual activity, which arguably there may have been, in fact, there almost certainly was, but if there's other illegal sexual conduct, that still has the same regular statute of limitations, which were well beyond that statute of limitations. So the only crimes we can be coming after anyone associated with Epstein would be if crimes involving a minor, and we're relying on the Protect Act to extend that statute of limitations. So that's how we get that past the statute of limitations issue. But we must remember it specifically has to be for abuse against a minor. That's A. Then B is we have the non-prosecution agreement. So how do we get around that with Ghislaine Maxwell? Because that was also raised in a motion to dismiss. Well, Judge Nathan ruled that only governs in two very restricting ways. It basically only restricts the Southern District of Florida from prosecuting, and only for crimes between 2007 and 2001. So according to Judge Nathan's interpretation of the law, which I would assume is a valid interpretation, she certainly knows this law better than I do. So according to her interpretation, that non-prosecution agreement would exempt all 5 of these co-conspirators of Epstein from being prosecuted specifically in the Southern District of Florida, not in New York or anywhere else in the country, and only for the periods of crimes that were between 2001 2007. So now Southern District of New York can prosecute for any crimes that were committed during any time. And in Southern District of Florida can prosecute for crimes that predate 2001. Now, given these limitations, so you can understand how it's possible, because the question I have is, why isn't Sarah Kellen here as a defendant? She seems to have taken over Ghislaine Maxwell's role. We heard Carolyn even testify on the stand that Sarah Kellen herself paid her $700 for her to take these illegal, basically do some snaps of a minor under, certainly under 18, taking snaps of a minor while she was not properly dressed. We'll just phrase it that way. So and Sarah Kellen was the photographer in that instance. You would think this is certainly something that's prosecutable, but the problem is that all happened in Florida. That's not in New York. There's no touching to New York. You can't. So New York can't prosecute for that. And Sarah Kellen, and that presumably happened between 2001 and 2007. So Sarah Kellen is exempt from prosecution because of that damn non-prosecution agreement that Alex Acosta signed off on when he let Epstein slip away. So that's why things that are just mind-blowing, obvious crimes that we're all frustrated by are not being prosecuted. So anytime we're looking at prosecutions, we need to work within those two contexts of understanding that A, it has to be something that is outside the Southern District of Florida, and B, you have to have something that is going to be something, if it's going to be in the Southern District of Florida, it can't be during that window of time. And the problem is, I think a lot of the flights to Lolita Island probably came in and out of the Southern District of Florida. So if that's the case, anything that happened between 2001 and 2007, which you want to put pressure on Sarah Kellen or Ghislaine Maxwell about, they can be like, well, I got a non-prosecution agreement. There's no pressure you can put on me for that. And there's no other court in the country that has venue to actually address this and convict me. So that's why, Southern District of New York can't prosecute for flights from Florida to Little St. James. That can only come from Southern District of Florida. So these are the limitations that we have. I'm not trying to give a pass to the prosecution because I definitely think there's corruption here in who they're protecting. But at the same time, we can't be ignorant of the law as to certain areas that the law and facts from the past, and most specifically the non-prosecution agreement, are binding and tying the hands of any good faith, genuinely earnest prosecutors who want to try and put everyone behind bars.
So earlier, one of you raised the point that the victims, the witnesses, were bombarded with questions in an attempt to destroy their credibility, reputations, etc. How hardcore was that questioning? And do they risk it backfiring, that strategy, whereby if you're going in heavy on a survivor of something so horrific, then you're going to look like the bad person at the end of the day? Kristan, do you want to tackle that one?
The prosecution seemed very woke. They're very careful about getting into the nitty-gritty details on a lot of things because they didn't want to trigger any of the witnesses. That's the way I viewed it. And we could have used a little bit more information about what happened there in order to, I would say, tug on the jury's heartstrings to understand what was happening in detail, even though that it was very graphic and probably even disturbing. I think making the jury a little uncomfortable would have worked in the prosecution's benefit. Instead, they were very woke. They were very, very dancing around things, is where the defense was okay with making the witnesses cry, which we saw in a couple situations. I think that they went a little gentle. We didn't really see Pomerantz or any passion until we saw Elizabeth Loftus, the defense's main star witness, take the stand, and she started poking holes on memories and memory contamination and how all these women may have communicated with each other, and there's cross contamination and filling in gaps of things that they forgot using each other's memories, and they went that whole route. We saw that Pomerantz come out and ask the question, didn't you take the witness stand for Harvey Weinstein? And then we saw the judge call sidebar, and that was never brought up again. So we saw some things that were just very gentle prosecution. It did seem they asked very defined questions, but again, I've only been involved in 2 trials that I've been, seen. I'm not a true crime expert, although I would say as a juror, as somebody that would be a juror in this kind of situation, I think having more graphic details would have stuck in the memory of people, because those are the kind of things that kind of sit in the back of your mind and go, there's no way, this is very graphic, this is very detailed, we know exactly what happened.
Okay, Addy, thanks.
Yeah, Jeffrey Poliuka's cross-examination of Caroline, I would say, was probably the most brutal of the witness cross-examinations, and I think a lot of that has to do with Caroline's background, being, growing up, being abused by her grandfather from the time she was 4, having addiction issues, which she still deals with to this day, including opiates and methadone and such, and the fact that she's just not. Like a witness like Annie Farmer, I think was the most intelligent and composed, and she's a psychologist, and Caroline just doesn't have some of those gifts, those mental gifts, so that may have hurt her in that sense, but she also, I think, didn't understand what Poliuka was doing, whereas anyone who knows a bit about manipulation and how lawyers can be, particularly star-powered criminal defense lawyers, they can get pretty nasty. So I think she kind of was confused, and I think the lawyers can speak to her redirect, because I actually missed the tail end of that day. But then the other one I wanted to bring up was Menninger's cross of, I think it was Jane, and the one that stuck out for me was when Menninger asked her, and they probably did this on purpose, having a woman cross her, because I thought it was interesting they had Poliuka do that, because he's a man. Menninger basically asked her about a time which may or may not have happened where she brought a man home from the airport that she had just met, kind of trying to play into the idea or bring up the idea that this is a loose woman who, because she's maybe promiscuous, she may not be credible. So those are the moments that stuck out for me.
All right, Matthew.
Yeah, I hang on a sec. Oh, sorry, guys. I'm trying to not be disruptive. Here we go. That the rather than that, I agree. I thought Poliuka's cross-examinations were particularly distasteful from my point of view. But just because we haven't mentioned it, Judge Nathan has gone out of her way to say that these witnesses should be able to testify with pseudonyms. In some, other than Annie Farmer, 2 of them have entirely, made up first names. In the case of Caroline, the last name wasn't given. And I think one issue that arose during all of these cross-examinations was the sort of seemingly intentional, maybe negligent, somewhere in between, dropping of names, saying the names of the actual brother, saying the names, in one case, blurting out the last name. And it's something that I guess it had the danger of getting out of control. I don't really know how much impact it had, because at least one of these witnesses testified in her own name after Epstein died, and Judge Berman did this sort of nolo prosequi kind of, I'm calling it a wake, but it wasn't a wake, but it was his attempt to let survivors speak. And so it's kind of an open secret. In fact, even on this broadcast, we've mentioned that which soap opera it is that Jane's is associated with. But I think that the defense lawyers, I'm sure they gamed, and I'm not saying there's anything, I'm sure they gamed it out, and I think that they did it a bit on purpose. Now, whether they thought they could rattle the witness by saying the names, whether they thought it would highlight to the jury how kind of absurd it is that people could get relatively large payouts from the Epstein compensation fund and then, and then be back here. It's just an aspect of the case I wanted to, and I don't know if it's going to be addressed as a disciplinary matter at the end of the trial. I don't know, but
that's what I was going to ask, if there were any consequences for name dropping like that. I was going to ask if there were any consequences for lawyers.
Yeah, I mean there can be, but I think what happens is, I'll understand. I'm going to try. There we go. I think the judge doesn't want to have that become central in the jury's mind. Like, if there are, they might come after the trial. If you see what I mean? Because to make a big stink in the middle of the trial has the danger of poisoning the jury's mind. Like, that's not for them. This is between her and the lawyers. I've seen cases where after a trial is over, an order to show cause is issued by the judge to explain why something happened. Maybe Joe can leap in on this one. The discipline of lawyers.
It's with the two lawyers who watched this trial, I'll tell you, this raises a really interesting ethical question about what is proper lawyering, what is good lawyering, and what is bad lawyering. And by that I mean the example that was given by Kristan and the one that was given by Matthew. One was talking about a situation, the prosecution questioning, and now where he was talking about the question that was raised by Laura Pomerantz, saying, didn't you also appear on behalf of Harvey Weinstein? And his reaction to that. And then I want to talk about what Matthew Lee was talking about with respect to Pagliuca throwing the names out there. So I think that both of these circumstances, the question that, let's start with Kristan's comment first. That is an inappropriate question to ask because it's not probative. It's designed to prejudice the jury, and you don't even need an answer from the defendant or the witness on the stand in order for the question to just leave a slam home thought in the jury's mind. Like, you're associating now Ghislaine Maxwell with Harvey Weinstein, who's notorious for his abuse of young girls. So now the point to that question from Laura Pomerantz was the question denied by the judge that and the objection sustained? Yes. And I'll tell you 100% it should have been. I thought it was effective lawyering on Laura's part to ask the question, because now it doesn't matter whether an answer is given. Now the jury cannot help but associate on some level Ghislaine Maxwell with this notorious abuser of young girls. That's what you as the prosecutor want. You don't care about the answer. You just want the jury making that link between Harvey Weinstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. There's no way. It's almost, you can't get that out of your brain anymore. So I think the question itself is a powerful question, and one can ask, seeing as how it's a question that it's going to be objected to and the objection is going to be sustained, are you almost testifying improperly? Or is that zealous advocacy on behalf of your client, which in this case, the United States of America, trying to prosecute, where you're using the rules and pushing those boundaries to the degree that you can get away with it, even though the question is improper? Is that ethically a great thing to do, or is that ethically an evil thing to do? And I think that you can fairly take either position, which makes it a really interesting question. And it's the same thing with what Jeff Pagliuca did, where he knew he's not supposed to be using Jane's real name, but he also knew that if I use her real name, that might get these other victims who hear that, your names are not as protected as you think you are. It might get to rattle them, which seems really devious and disgusting. At the same time, he's trying to help Ghislaine Maxwell any way possible. So he's trying to zealously advocate and get away with the rules and push the rules as far as he can. And then he knows, I'm probably not going to get any sort of punishment for this because I'll be able to claim it was an accident and no one's going to punish me. At the same time, it may really, really help my client here to have these other witnesses be a little bit scared to go after her. So in both of these cases, we're seeing lawyers who are pushing the envelope beyond what the rules tell them that they're supposed to be doing it, and just up to the point that they feel they can get away with it. Now, so that the question really is, the ethical question is that type of lawyering a great thing to do? because you're zealously advocating, or is that really a very evil thing to do, where it's really you're intentionally flouting the rules and pushing those rules as far as you can get? That, I think, is something that fair minds can differ on. And I just wanted to share that perspective with you as to what's happening, so you can understand what's happening, and then you could sort of reach a decision on that calculus yourself as to what do we want our lawyers to be doing? Do we want them to be bending these rules as far as they can get away with it, or do we want them to be strictly complying with those rules? And I think that's an interesting topic, to me at least. And I would ask each of you. I would ask you, Sean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I'm curious about your takeaway.
Wow. So, I had an ecstasy importation case in Arizona, and I fought the case for 26 months. And whenever I went to court, my lawyer portrayed me to be a child protege, stock market whiz kid, gone bad. And the prosecutor portrayed me to be the Antichrist. And neither were true. And I was just thinking, I can't speak. I can't say anything. I know the truth. This isn't like facts, this is theater. So, I was in a fortunate enough position to have a private lawyer and be put on a good show. But if you've got no money and you get a public defender, which seems to be the majority of the cases, the state has all the resources in the world to put on a good show. And inevitably, innocent people fall through the cracks, including on death row, because my lawyer got Ray Crone, the snaggletooth killer, off death row. So when the consequences could be life and death, I think you've got bigger criminals in the justice system than you have in the prison system, when these people are just pushing. Because if you look at Ray Crone's case, I mean, they knew the bite mark didn't match. They knew the DNA didn't match. They paid an expert witness to testify. $50,000 they gave him to say the bite mark matched. So there's got to be a line that you can't cross when people's lives are at stake. Yeah, you want an aggressive lawyer to get you out of the shit, but it can go way too far. People, some of these prosecutors, it's all about their own careers. And even when Ray Crone, when they knew he was innocent, they were pushing to have him executed so that their careers and reputations wouldn't unwind, which is absolutely sick and sinister.
It is. It is.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got another question come in from Matthew Steeples then, which is, what is the panel's view about Maxwell being surveyed in London by the Met Police at her Stanhope Mews East residence in 1994? And why was nothing done about her then? Are you aware of this surveillance, Kristan?
I'm not really well versed in the surveillance from 1994, but it wouldn't surprise me. Surveillance is nothing new. We live and die in it in our smart grids and smart cities and just about every facet and form, with facial recognition and gate sensors. And in the 90s, they really didn't have that technology. So I'm kind of curious on what kind of surveillance they did. If they, like we saw in William Cooper's case, where they rented out apartments across the road from where he lived, and aerial photographs, and following them and interviewing places where they frequent. I'm kind of curious on what type of surveillance was actually done.
Well, get in touch with Matthew Steeples after this then, because he's an expert on that. All right, Addy?
Yeah, that's news to me. I find it interesting that it was during that time period that the Met was surveilling them, because I would have thought that she already would have been under the tabs of domestic intel, MI5, as they are called, over across the pond there in your neck of the woods there, Sean. So I don't know if something, I want to know what exactly was happening around that time that triggered that, because it's usually not out of the blue. Maybe was Epstein's arrival or comings and goings.
Reports to the police were that she was running a brothel, so they put her under surveillance.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm guessing what happened then is it went up the chain eventually and got shut down. Yeah.
Anything on that, Matthew?
No, I mean, I don't know. Just in this, not mentioned in the case, but during the trial, obviously reading about the very detailed allegation of Virginia Roberts Giuffre of I don't know if it's that same residence of being brought there to be with Prince Andrew, where the famous photograph is taken. It seems like that was a pretty bold move, but he wouldn't even need to have surveillance. Supposedly, he's going to have his own security. I'm kind of amazed in what I've learned about Andrew from these cases, how hushed up things were. I do want to take this. I mean, and obviously the precedent should go toward the questions coming in over the transom. But we all know this, but we haven't discussed it yet. If there's an opportunity to, this reference in Epstein's sweetheart deal that he received in Florida in the 2006, 2008, that he shouldn't pay forfeiture because he has cooperated with the FBI. And it's this weird line, right? It's a very weird line. And I think, a person could say, well, that just meant that he did some kind of an exit interview with them, or he's cooperated with them in some logistical way. But it seems to be a huge issue, really, of like what's really going on with this case. What was the reason for cutting him that deal, and why did it take so long, and what's the goal of this prosecution? I don't know personally. I've received that question many times. What did Epstein tell the FBI? Who really was Epstein? What did Epstein do between 1981 and 1987, between Bear Stearns and Towers Financial and Adnan Khashoggi and all this stuff? But to me, it's a very interesting issue. And how early on did Maxwell know Jeffrey Epstein? Was it, as it's so often portrayed, that she was looking for another strong man with money after the death of her father? Or did he play some role in Maxwell's purchase of the Daily News here? And was there some cooperation on the kind of intelligence things we're saying? These are, to me, they're open questions. And I don't know if this trial could have answered it, but it's extremely frustrating that it not only didn't try, but didn't even went out of its way to redact, a particular flight log from 1991, a flight from Wilmington, Delaware to New York right before Maxwell bought the Daily News, that apparently had Ghislaine Maxwell on it. But this is redacted, and why Judge Nathan would redact something that old that has nothing to do with protecting victims. So that's my expansive answer to a British intelligence question I don't know much about.
Okay, good point. Thanks, Matthew.
So that surveillance was by British intelligence or by CIA?
All right, so Matthew has pointed out then this was at the Stanhope Mews East residence in 1994, and the surveillance was by the London Metropolitan Police. So that's not the Belgravia residence where we filmed the Bannister at. This is a separate London residence. Yeah.
Because I thought you were. I misunderstood. I thought it was the CIA. I was surprised that America would have been that expansive in their investigations, considering this is before 9/11. The power of DHS and the laws have been so expanded for our federal government to surveil its own citizenry in the wake of 9/11 that something like that happening prior to 9/11 would have been very surprising to me. But if you tell me that it was the British government that was surveilling her, that's a question I think for your own government that I think might go outside of it. Certainly goes outside anything I know about.
Yeah, and the London Met Police are the very same police who refused to investigate Prince Andrew and all this other stuff. All right, so we've just got about 2 minutes left each. If I'll just go around the panel then. If each of you just want to give a conclusion to today's discussion, and also just remind the viewers, please, where they can find you and support you out online. Start with Kristan.
Yeah, I think that if you're out there, you're like us here, where we really would like to see justice served. And we're just left with more questions on why the prosecution did not provide more hard evidence, especially with confiscating 40,000 CDs, DVDs, not being able to call on certain witnesses because of immunity issues, people pleading the fifth. I don't think they pulled all stops to put Ghislaine Maxwell in jail, so I wouldn't be surprised if she was acquitted. At the same time, I still think that there's a great opportunity of her actually being put in jail. And if that happens, What does that mean? How long will she live in jail? I'm not sure. But if you guys want to stay in touch, I'm live 5 days a week on KGRA Radio. You can find my show on TalkStream Live. You can find me on KGRA DB, therundownlive.com. As you guys know, we've had the media had our photographs taken by Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Isabel Maxwell. So that was kind of like a mock threat to some people. Why would she do that? But you guys can support us there. And when the news breaks, we will definitely have it on the rundownlive.com. We have transcripts straight from the stenographer, which no one else seems to be publishing. That of Jane Doe, of Katie, of Carolyn, of Annie Farmer, the butler, as they call him, as well as the Kelly McGuire raid files from Epstein's estate, where they found evidence tape already on a lot of the binders of CDs and DVDs, leaving even more questions because no one knew where they came from or if they were linked to any other cases. They couldn't find anything. So you can find all that out and more. Support these individuals here. A lot of us, New York's expensive. Support Addy Ads. Support Joe. Support Matt. Support everyone out here. Support Sean, help these guys out, because let's be honest, the mainstream media is dying. This is more of what people want. They want normal people, citizen journalists, independent reporters out there reporting. And if you want to support me, we have a GoFundMe to replace a laptop that was stolen. I had my Airbnb broken into, and the only thing they stole was my laptop. If you want to support that and support the trip and the cause and the transcripts, you can do that at therundownlive.com. But don't think twice about supporting these guys here. They deserve it as much as anyone. And you guys stay blessed. And hopefully we get a promising verdict that works in the favor and reestablishes faith in the judicial system.
Thanks, Kristan. Addy?
Yeah, so very limited scope of a trial, as many of us have mentioned. A couple things I wanted to add too. I actually asked Jeffrey Pagliuca about the name dropping on the way into court one day. No response from Mr. Pagliuca on that one. And then as far as the, related to, I think what a couple of you guys brought up with regards to intelligence and the FBI evidence tape that was already found on certain items and hard drives at the 71st Street address, testified under oath by Miss Kelly McGuire of the FBI. How did those tags, how did that tape get there? I think that's a great question. And then I also wanted to add the quote that Mr. Lee mentioned. This is from an FBI document. Quote, Epstein has also provided information to the FBI as agreed upon. So the question was, what does that mean? What does that exactly mean? And because I had Ryan Dawson message me, he's like, Epstein is he's not an FBI informant. But now it's like, I'm not sure. What does that mean? I think that's a great question. But you can find me on Twitter at @1AddyAds, one spelled out ONEADDYADDS for the quickest updates on the trial. And then I do a longer video broadcast in the evenings. I'm sending people to Rockfin now, which is a great service. And then if people want to support, you can buy me a coffee or subscribe to our Patreon, etc. Venmo, Cash App, but buy me a coffee is kind of where I'm sending people because it's internationally friendly. But yeah, I want to thank you, Sean, too. This is really an honor to be on your show, and it's great. I've been a fan of your work for many years now, and it's all you guys. It's your work. I really, really respect all you guys.
Thank you, Addy. It's great to hear how much you've dived into this and all the knowledge. Okay, Matthew.
Okay, sure. I guess I'm going to go. I'm obviously really into this trial, but I also see the issue of kind of court transparency is one that's become something that I'm working on in a variety of cases. There was a case here about a company called Ease, and Wirecard was involved in it. And basically, I think that by there are a lot of things that are redacted and held confidential in courts which shouldn't be. And often there's just not enough interest by, I guess you were saying, the mainstream press, or there are not enough filings challenging these things. And when I first got here, I would ask, existing freedom of the press groups, and they would be very selective and say, no, this case is not important enough to make our request, or we don't want to make a request that'll set bad law. And I just decided, people should know more about courts. In federal courts, unlike the state court where you were talking about with Kyle Rittenhouse, there are no cameras. So during COVID, there's been this window where federal courts have allowed call-in lines. And it's something that I'm pushing even at this 11th hour in this trial to get reinstated. but I think it's one that should remain a norm going forward, because this would allow many more people to cover it. Now, some journalists here at the courthouse think it's kind of a conflict of interest. It's kind of better if people know less and they can be the ones purveying it. I don't think so. I think the more people know, the better. And then hopefully you have value added and some analysis. So rather than I'm tweeting all of the things that you're saying, I've been working throughout the trial and before it on a project that I'm calling Maximum Maxwell. And it's basically ready to go, but to have the title right, got to know the verdict. So I've got a couple working titles and I will be launching it, I hope, within hours of the verdict. It may not be the best book about this trial, but I will tell you that it should be the first. It'll be on Amazon and elsewhere. And I also have written a book about the UN, which I encourage people to look at the UN not as really look at it in detail and the dangers of impunity, of allowing peacekeepers to be deployed and commit sexual abuse with no legal repercussions at all, to allow diplomats to run people over and take bribes and simply fly home. This is a secondary project that I'm working on, and that book is called Belt and Roadkill. It involves Chinese bribery at the United Nations. And thanks a lot for having me on. I like all these guys. I've liked this conjunto quite a lot.
Thanks, Matthew. I think Kevin Annette would be a good guy for you to collaborate with out of Canada. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he does stuff on the UN and China and the Pope and all this stuff. All right, Joe, over to you.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to echo what Matthew was just saying. Some of the largest frustration the public has had is with the lack of transparency, the lack of exposure, despite the world hunger to know what's happening inside this trial. And what's been even more frustrating for me is this. Myself, Matthew, Kristan, Addy, all of us are people who are out there trying to give whatever publicity we can to it, and so few people have been willing to have us on to talk about what we're seeing. There were fewer than 200 people who witnessed this trial day by day. We happen to be 4 of them, and most of the people who witnessed it are journalists whose messaging is necessarily going to be filtered by legacy media. And unfortunately, we all are aware of fake news. This is not merely an American problem. This is an international problem, that you cannot trust your news. The only people you can trust are really independent individuals like myself, like Matthew, like Kristan, like Addy Ads. So I want to thank you, Sean, for having me on here, for having all of us on here. I want to thank Addy in particular, because he actually introduced me to you to get me on here. And I'm going to urge your viewers, please, we're each putting out different forms of content, but it's not filtered through a narrative that we want to get somewhere. We're looking at the facts, and based on the facts that we're seeing, just trying to come to fair and reasonable conclusions. And with respect to my own channel, my channel is Good Logic. Like I said at the outset, I talk about law, I talk about politics, but I also really like to I'll make your brain think, and I'll make you laugh. That's my goal. I want you to think about questions like, what type of lawyering is ethically proper? What should we be looking for? And make you really consider questions that you probably never considered before. And I also want to entertain my viewers as well. I want them to have a good time while they're watching this show. So I urge you, check me out on YouTube. It's Good Logic, Lawgic. And again, I cannot thank you enough. Please follow us so that we can help get our message out to the public. With that, we can't do it. We're doing our part. All you got to do is just click follow. It's not that hard. And I thank you again, Sean, for the wonderful experience of meeting you and having an opportunity to talk about this very important case with the public at large.
Oh, well, thank you, Kristan, Addy, Matthew, and Joe. It's been, so engaging, informative. I could talk to you guys for hours on this case, but unfortunately we have run out of time. Huge thank you to everyone for spending the time with us this evening, especially Addy for coordinating this with all of these guests and putting together such a good panel, and Ash also for coordinating this. And, we will repost some of this to Odyssey and other platforms, but I'm banned from putting it on YouTube. So if any of you guys want to repost any of this content, just, send me a message and I'll retransfer the file over. You're welcome to do whatever you want with it. And if you are the viewers out there, thanks for the questions. And again, it is so important to support everybody on the platforms during this era of extreme censorship on cases such as this. All right, guys, wherever you are in the world, everybody have a good day. Thank you again. Cheers. Thank you from London.
Stay frosty.
Godspeed.
Stay blessed.
Thanks. Bye-bye.